the League of Women Voters to explain to us today what we're going to see on the Alameda ballot in terms of propositions and whatever else is on there. So confusing to me. And they will be explaining it to us. And you are going to introduce our speaker, and we are most appreciative.
Good Yantov.
Good Yantov.
I am Anna Crane. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters. Our mission is to protect democracy by defending the right to vote and providing unbiased information to help voters make their choice. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Neil Rubenstein, who is our programs chair. He's a retired attorney with 38 years of practice, and he's also, incidentally, and to my great pleasure, my husband and partner of 44 years.
Hold on just a minute. There, try that. Now that you don't need it.
Okay, now that I don't need it, without further ado, here's Neil.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We have a handout. Does everybody have it? Tell you what, I've got some extra copies. Can somebody help me? Yeah, no, I brought a bunch. So I've got more here, and if you need that. Okay, here we go. Take as many as you need. Okay, why don't we get started? Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. As Anna said, my name is Neil Rubenstein. What I was asked to talk about, and which I actually will be doing, is talking about the 10 ballot measures that are on the ballot that you probably already have received from the County Register of Voters. Thanks. Just keep it if you need it. I am not going to be talking about any individual candidates. This is just simply about the ballot measures. All of the measures are going to be, that you're going to be seeing on your ballot, which we'll be talking about today, are statewide measures, either passed by the legislature or through initiative. There were some City of Alameda initiatives or propositions that were considered by the Alameda City Council. None of them were passed and are on the ballot. There also was a measure that was adopted by the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, which would have been a $20 billion bond measure for affordable housing in the 9 Bay Area counties. And you probably maybe even saw that in some of the advertising for this program today. After they approved it to go on the ballot, there were several lawsuits and a fair amount of opposition, and they withdrew it from the ballot. I think they realized that there were some legal deficiencies in the process that they followed, and so anyway, so we're not going to be talking about it today for obvious reasons because it's not on the ballot. What you've got in your handout is a list of by name of the 10 ballot measures that I'm going to be talking about. And they're there in the order that I'm going to be talking about them. That is not the same order as they appear on your ballot, but the proposition number there is shown, so it's easy enough to find. The 3 of them relate to bond measures. And for those of you who don't know, do you need something?
No, somebody has music playing on their phone.
Oh. Okay, who's to blame? Anyway, thank you. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, a bond measure is simply a loan that a government agency takes out. Typically, it's through some private equity fund or some bank or some other financial institution in which they borrow some money to be used for some governmental public purpose, and it's paid off over a period of time at interest, the principal, just like any private loan. What a bond measure does is it basically is requesting
Sorry, the music was somewhat distracting.
There we go. Okay, thank you. No problem. No problem.
I won't say what.
No problem. It was nice music, but thank you.
No, it was on silence as well as airport, so.
Welcome to my world, yes. No worries, don't worry about it. Anyway, so what the bond measures are is basically you're being asked to, as voters, to approve the government taking out this bond. And the annual interest payments and principal are paid by subsequent tax revenues over the life of it. One of the bond measures, which is for $10 billion, is seeking funds for public school and community college facilities construction and renovation. It's very common in California. It's a very typical kind of bond in California for public education. And typically with these kinds of bonds, the state government pays about half the cost for construction, and the local district would pay the other half. And so these are pretty much set up the same way. So for this particular bond, again, there would be money allocated to send to K through 12 schools, some for charter schools, and some for community colleges. That's Proposition 2. Proposition 4 is also a $10 billion bond. It's a separate bond, which would be used to pay for certain climate-related matters, such as safe drinking water, like dams, reservoirs, things of that nature, reduce flooding risk, seawall protection, and wildfire protection. One of the problems is that in a lot of the areas of the state where you have these problems, you have basically overgrowth of trees and brush, and so some of it would be used to clean that away. And so anyway, so this would be funds raised for that purpose. Some of the money as provided in the bond would be spent directly by the state government. Others would be allocated to local government agencies to spend for various purposes. Yes?
Do you know the duration of that project, or are they looking at a five-year plan for that, or a 10-year plan?
Well, the bond for the one I was just talking about, the repayment period is going to be, let me see, basically over 40 years.
40 years.
Right. Now, obviously, what will happen is the money is going to be spent much faster than that, but it's a long-term payout. You will find in in the materials that you have received from the Secretary of State's office, there's a voter's guide that goes into a lot more detail, talks about the specific dollar amounts, what they're going to be allocated for, and how much it's estimated it's going to cost to repay the bond, because essentially what you're paying interest on. So all that, the detail is in the documents that you already have. If for some reason you can't find it, the California Secretary of State has that voter information guide on their website, which is SOS, Secretary of State, .ca.gov. Yeah. But one of the things with these bonds, most of the money is intended to be used for essentially capital improvements. In other words, you're going to be constructing something that ideally is going to have a useful life longer than the payout period for the for the bond. So those are the two actual bond measures that are on the ballot. There is also a Proposition 5, which is not itself a bond measure, but is very much related to that. As you all recall, some years back, there was an initiative that was passed in California that provided for local government funding. That required a 2/3 vote of the of the voters in order to pass, for local bond measures, and which is obviously makes it very difficult to comply. The bond measure the measure that's on the ballot this year would reduce that threshold from 2/3 to 55% for certain types of projects, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So in addition to the state being able to acquire bonds, local governments like cities and counties can do so as well. And so Proposition 5 is dealing with bonds that might be obtained by like the city of Alameda or the county of Alameda. And there's basically, under this proposal, two different kinds of bonds would be treated differently in the sense of what percentage of approval is needed for them to be passed. One would be for local bonds, for bonds that are designed for affordable housing purposes, basically in providing down payments or subsidies for affordable housing. And for this purpose, affordable housing is defined in the measure as housing that would be used by people who have a family income of no more than 150% of the median family income in the particular county or city, as the case may be. So for example, if the median family income was $60,000 a year, then people with income of up to $90,000 per year would be eligible for it. The idea behind that is it would be available, the proceeds would be available to help not only lower income people, but more moderate income people who basically, are working, but are really strapped given the high cost of housing in California. This measure does not actually constitute a bond. It merely is a means that if a local government wanted to propose a bond to be used for that purpose, then the threshold for voter approval would be 55%. Yes?
Well, would the local government determine the down payments, would those have to be repaid at some point in time?
Okay, it would depend on what the government agency decided. In other words, what this Proposition 33 does is essentially talks about subject matter. That it would apply to these bonds covering particular subject matters such as affordable housing. The actual specifics of what the measure would be determined by the local government agency proposing it and be subject to voter approval. So, obviously that's a good question, but this measure doesn't answer the question. It says this is a subject matter that would be considered by the local agency and the voters in that jurisdiction. Yes?
For Prop 2 and 4, are bonds primarily or completely paid for by homeowners, like a special assessment? Is that how they're?
No, they would be paid for by general tax revenues. Right. Yeah. Basically, the state government gets tax revenues in a variety of ways. So it'd basically go into the general pool like any other expense. Okay, for Proposition 5, as it relates to the local bonds, the other category that would be available is for local bonds for public infrastructure, such as for safe drinking water, flood control, transit, road improvements, and things of that nature. Again, it works the same way as the affordable housing type of bond that we just talked about, but it's a different subject matter. Yes?
Would that include schools?
Schools construction?
Yes.
Typically not. Because those generally are subject to other bonds, like the one we were just talking about. You can have school bonds as they exist now. Now, currently in California, local school bonds are currently subject to the 55% threshold. They already are. So this measure wouldn't be changing anything because that's one of the exceptions that was passed a few years ago. So it's just adding 2 more exceptions to it.
What are the boundaries? Because almost anything built by a public entity is public infrastructure. So does it include all roads, all sewers, all firehouses, all police stations, police?
Okay. The short answer to your question is, and I'm not meaning to be flippant, is in the voter information guide, it has the text of it, and what it does is it lists about 10 or 15 different categories. And they're fairly broad. So I think the answer probably to much of that is it could, but again, as with the question over here, is it would, in any given bond proposal made under this, it would have to provide some specificity as what it's for. And so this is just kind of the subject matter. And again, it's not actually authorizing any bonds. It's simply creating the means by which they could be approved by a 55% vote.
With these ones, the ones that have the 40-year payback, do you know in general, are they adjustable rate? Is it a fixed rate? Do you know? I'm just curious what ends up looking like the debt burden in this case.
Okay. I think it can be either. One of the things that you will see, I mean, these are great questions, and there's actually information is available, is in the voter information guide that you can get from the Secretary of State. They actually provide that information about the kinds of bonds, what the estimated costs are going to be, and so forth. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, but the information is available in the voter information guide that you can have for each one. And also kind of the estimated interest payments that it's going to be over a period of time. So a lot of times these are fixed rate. Yeah. And one of the requirements for these bonds is that the voters be given this information about what the estimated cost is, because obviously it's a big deal. And yeah, that's a great question, but it's in there. Okay, another subject that's covered by the ballot measures you're going to be seeing deals with rent control. And one of the things that I want to make clear, what I'm doing today is I'm acting hopefully as a provider of information. I am not an advocate one way or the other. Rent control is very, there are very good arguments on both sides, and there are a lot of people that advocate very strongly for each side. And so I'm not advocating for anything, but it is an issue that can affect almost all of us. There's actually 2 of them. One of them obviously deals with rent control. The other one, which is 33, Proposition 34 also deals with rent control, even though it doesn't say that it does, and I'll explain that in a moment. With Proposition 33, what it would do is expand a local government's authority, like a city or a county, to enact rent control on residential property. Under current law in California, a lot of this is governed by a law that was passed by the legislature back in 1995. And under that law, which is still in existence, local governments have the authority to impose rent control on residential property built prior to that date, meaning prior to 1995, but not for property built after that date. And the reason for that is historical, is when this bill was being considered, again, 30 years ago, there was a concern that rent control would inhibit development of housing. So the idea was, well, The housing that's already built is already there, so we're going to give the localities, local governments, the authority to regulate rent control on the housing that's already there, because that certainly isn't going to affect the availability of that housing because it already exists. But in an effort not to, it was a classic compromise, in an effort not to inhibit future development, the 1995 law basically created this distinction between when the property was built. And in 1996, that really didn't make much of a difference. But it's now 30 years later, and there's been a lot of housing that has been built since then, which currently is not subject to local government rent control. And it's no secret, cost of housing is high in California. And the state has some regulation over rent control, which I'll talk about in a moment, even for post-1995 housing, but it's very limited. And so obviously there are a lot of people who believe that rent control for post-1995 residential housing should be put into effect. And currently local governments are not allowed to do that, but under this proposal, they would be able to do that. So Alameda might do one thing, Oakland might do something else, San Francisco might be something else. I mean, it would be very much local driven. Now, the obvious advantage to that in the short term from this tenant standpoint is if you live in a jurisdiction that imposes a rent control, it means you may have lower cost of housing. The flip side of that, of course, is that building housing, maintaining housing, repairing housing costs money. And if there is if a city government, for example, imposes rent control, that could have the effect, depending on what the specific provision was, of impeding construction of new development. And I think it's kind of well known we have a shortage of affordable housing. And so the argument goes, if you impose rent control, which have the effect of dissuading developers from building new housing, you're actually going to make the affordable housing problem even worse. Yes?
How does that intersect with the mandate from the state that cities need to create more housing, particularly low income housing?
Well, it's interesting. What the state requirement is that the cities must approve new housing. And so, for example, if you have a developer, and you're putting your finger exactly on the point, is one of the problems or a major problem that the state law was designed to affect was that local governments, through zoning and permitting requirements, wouldn't give permission to build low-income housing or affordable housing. And so what the state government measure is, they have to, is within these constraints of that law, they have to be more open to providing permission and have approvals for building it. But it doesn't mean that the housing is actually going to be built, because if you don't have a developer that is going to feel it's economically in their interest to build the housing, it's not going to happen. That is one of the things that this $20 billion bond measure, from the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority was looking to address, is basically providing, in the broadest terms, subsidies of some sort, so that you would be able to, so that it would pencil out economically for a developer to do it, because whether the developer got a subsidy or whether the tenants got a subsidy or something else, there would be some money available to make it happen. Obviously, that's not there. And so the concern you're addressing, I think, is a real one in that if you have rent control such that developers can't get loans or can't economically build anything, then it's not going to happen. Yes?
Thank you. I'm aware of to a degree, of the state's requirement of various communities to increase housing by a certain percentage as they determine the need. But I don't remember, or did I really have the understanding of how that is divided in regards to family housing and or rental housing? How is that divvied up in those requirements?
I'm going to punt by saying it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. It's an important issue. That law has already been passed. And I mean, as far as what those requirements are, and they're complex, and I don't know off the top of my head all of the specifics of them.
I thought in terms of the argument that it would, say, 33 would inhibit the growth of rental housing in relation to what's being required by the state.
Well, rental housing for purposes of Proposition 3 includes both apartment buildings and it includes houses that are being rented out. So the concept is residential, meaning somebody's living there as opposed to business. So so the breadth of Proposition 33 would cover both.
That's an important point, though, that in Alameda, a lot of our rental housing is single-family homes. None of them are covered by current rent control laws due to this state law that this would alter. So a lot of the rental stock in Alameda is single-family home, and it would become under rent control if this proposition passed, as I understand.
Well, not directly. What would happen is the Alameda City Council could adopt an ordinance providing that. And so you'd have the political issue within the city as to whether that's going to happen. The obstacle would go away. And yeah, there's going to be, if this does pass, there's obviously going to be a lot of discussion in local municipalities about what they should do. So it's not automatic, but it's something that's clearly out there. Yeah.
If Proposition 33 passes, will that allow cities to do what's called, to keep rent control on vacant property? Currently, when a tenant moves out, the landlord can raise the rent to market value.
Mm-hmm.
But I know there's been talk in trying to bring that under control. Is that affected by Proposition 33, or will the state keep control of the fact that vacant property may be rented at market value?
Well, vacant in the sense that there's a building on it, but nobody's living in it?
The tenant moves out.
Okay, as opposed to undeveloped property.
Right.
Okay. What the law what the proposition would say is the state may not limit and I'm just reading from the state may not limit the right of any city, county, or city and county to maintain, enact, or expand residential rent control. So it's very broad. So what I think the result would be is, yes, cities would be authorized to do that if they chose to do that. But obviously, that's my opinion of the reading of it, but that's the language that's there, yeah. So, yeah, so it is potentially a huge change. And what you're going to undoubtedly have is some cities are going to want to enact rent control and others aren't.
Oh, I was just going to get two comments. One, just since you're talking about how every city, there's a law that says every city needs to pass, I think it's called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, around allowing for growth. I believe Alameda was the first city in California to have its RHNA approved. So I just think we're kind of a cool city in that regard. And this is not about rent control, but what's interesting for cities like, I think there's several cities in Marin, San Mateo, and different places where they've been pushing back against having to get their RENA approved by the state. There's something called builder's remedy. And so it's interesting to start to see where in cities where the city and the city council won't pass zoning that allows for new housing, not necessarily like rental housing, but just any housing. Eventually, developers are going to start to be allowed to just build, and as long as it's to the building code. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's going to start to happen more in places where cities are being really against any new growth at all.
No, you're right. I mean, that is a very interesting law. But the distinction and I think the interplay is that law deals with government restrictions on what can and can't be built and developers' remedies if the government doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing or what the law requires. But it doesn't create money in the sense of if you don't have a developer who's willing to do the construction, no matter, the city can't force the developer to do it. It's permission. And so these are related issues, but they're separate because the state law doesn't create the money to actually build any housing.
But it's interesting. It intersects in part because with a lot of the rules that different cities put on developers, and even if done with good intentions, it's so expensive to build. A lot of the affordable housing you see being built, it's about $1 million per unit. So you look at this bond for $20 billion, it'll build like 20,000 units total because it's $1 million. That's how it ends up being $1 million a unit. The other thing I was going to say, the gentleman in front, I think it's called vacancy. There's like the rent control and there's vacancy control. And so when the city says that when someone leaves, you still cannot raise the rent to market, that's known as vacancy control.
Right.
And so this past, a city could choose to enact a vacancy, or like a rent control or a vacancy control type of regulation.
You're right. One thing I was asked to do is to be finished by 2:00.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, well, I think somebody's going to be using the room afterwards. I think there's some enforcement mechanisms here. So why don't we, I mean, what everybody's saying is incredibly good, I mean, and important. But it just really does show how important this issue is, because it really is going to affect everybody, even if we're not renters, because it has much wider effect. Proposition 34, which is the other rent control measure, actually is designed, and I don't think even though you don't see it in the statute or in the proposition, I don't think I'm saying anything that's a secret, is there's an organization called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is involved in the prescription drug industry as a charitable organization.
Can you say the name of it again?
AIDS Healthcare Foundation.
The idea.
Yeah, you know, like the illness, AIDS, yeah. And they have, their current rent control law is a proposition. Actually, it's the third time this type of a law has been presented to the voters in California in the last few years. I think once it was in 2018 and other times in 2020. The prior times the rent control law was presented to the voters, it was defeated. So this is kind of the third go-around. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation has been a large financial supporter of these rent control measures, both the last two and the current one that's on the ballot. I mean, there are other supporters, of course, but they have spent a lot of money on it. And essentially what Proposition 34 is designed to do is to limit the spending that certain types of organizations can use for these kinds of purposes. I think it's essentially, it says it's to restrict spending of prescription drug revenues by certain healthcare providers that can be only used by certain purposes. The reality of it is if you look at it carefully, is it's targeted towards the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Basically, because the companies that are covered by it are very limited, and you compare that to this organization, and it's largely designed to keep this organization from spending a lot of money for the rent control proposals. There is some litigation about whether that is even an appropriate use of the initiative, but anyway, that's what it's about. And if you look at the ballot arguments for and against Proposition 34, you'll notice that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is one of the opponents for obvious reasons. So it's an interesting use of the initiative process, but it really, if you read the initiative, it's not really understandable on its face, but that's really what's going on. Another, getting off the issue of rent control, there's Proposition 3, which is basically a constitutional right to marriage. Back in 2008, the state of California passed an initiative, it made part of the California Constitution, a provision saying that only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California, essentially outlawing same-sex marriage. That law was later held unconstitutional. As you recall, the U.S. Supreme Court had decided that basically the rights of liberty for other constitutional provisions that was something that was a protected constitutional right under the U.S. Constitution. Accordingly, that 2008 initiative in California has been dormant and unenforceable since then. Now, given, I'm trying to avoid giving my personal opinions, given the Dodd case overruling Roe versus Wade, in which the U.S. Supreme Court essentially said that the right to abortion, which the court had previously said was a federally constitutionally protected law, no longer applied. Basically, they reversed themselves. There is concern among some people that the U.S. Supreme Court may do the same thing with respect to the right to marriage. And if they do that, what would happen, as is happening with some abortion laws in other states, is that a law that had previously been held to be unconstitutional and dormant would spring to life. And that without any action by anybody, that such a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court would have the effect of bringing back to life the 2008 initiative. The purpose of Proposition 3, by declaring this constitutional right to marriage, is to deal with that possibility in the sense that it provides that it expressly repeals the 2008 initiative. It also says that the right to marry is a fundamental right. And so the rationale behind it is if that becomes the law in California, even if the U.S. Supreme Court basically overturns its prior decision on this subject about federal constitutional law, the California law would still protect same-sex marriage. That's what's going on with that in a nutshell. There's Proposition 32 would make a slight increase in the minimum wage in California. Currently, there is state mandated minimum wage floors in California. And currently in California, I think it's about, as of January 1st next year, it would be, I think, $16.50 an hour would be the floor. This would raise the floor slightly so that it would be about $18 an hour for employers with 26 or more employees and $17 for employers with 25 or fewer. Both the existing law and this law has inflation kickers, so the floor would increase over time based on cost of living increases. But essentially what it does is it raises the floor by $1, $1.50 an hour. Some municipalities have their own higher minimum wage requirements, and those would not be affected. In other words, under both existing law and under this law, they would have the same right to do it as they do now. It just raises the state floor a little bit. There's another initiative, which is Proposition 36, that deals with criminal penalties and charges. I'm sure all of you have been, if you've been alive in the last several years, are aware of the problem of the increase in shoplifting, snatch and grab type of crimes, in which small amounts, I shouldn't say small, but relatively small dollar amount items being taken, but oftentimes in many, many thefts. One of the, again, I'm trying to avoid expressing any opinions on the subject. Based on an initiative that was passed in 2014, Proposition 47, there was a law that said that for certain property theft crimes in which the amount stolen or the value of the amount stolen was $950 or less, those would be treated as misdemeanors, meaning that the maximum penalty could not exceed a year in the county jail. So somebody's convicted of that could not go to prison, a state prison, and also could not be sentenced to a term for more than 1 year. And the way it plays out is if you've got somebody who has committed multiple $900 thefts, each one is considered a misdemeanor, and they can't be stacked or aggregated. And there is concern that part of the reason you're seeing this increase in these kinds of thefts is because the punishment is so low. And although the idea behind the law, I think, was to not create excessive punishments. So, for example, we've all been teenagers. Many of us have had teenagers, children who are teenagers. And young adults and teenagers do stupid things. And you don't want somebody's life to be ruined by having a felony conviction for something stupid they did when they were 18 years old. The problem, which seems to have been the case, is although that may be a worthy goal, the reality is people have essentially taken advantage of it by, you have a lot of thefts. Basically, you have one person doing this over and over again, or you have people conspiring, basically working together, to do thefts from retail outlets and people's cars and things of that nature. And so the reality, the objective behind that has had these adverse consequences. So one of the things that Proposition 36 would do is it would provide that if somebody had 3 or more such offenses, the third and further ones could be treated as felonies. Provides in some circumstances, if somebody does multiple, the dollar amounts can be aggregated to get over the $950. If you have people kind of working together to do this, an organized ring, they could be treated as felonies, with the idea of trying to address the problem that we've just been talking about. Proposition 36 has another component that's crime, deals with crime, but is separate from this property theft issue, which deals with drugs. And one of the things that it would do is it would treat fentanyl as a hard drug like heroin or cocaine, such that if somebody was a dealer was convicted, they would have the harsher of selling fentanyl. They would have the harsher criminal penalties that would apply as if it was heroin or cocaine, as opposed to for less severe drugs, the penalties are lower. Another thing it does is as to users of drugs. And it provides something that they call a treatment mandated felony, which means that for an individual who has been convicted of two drug convictions for possession, we're not talking about dealing, but for possession, the third go-around, the prosecutor would have discretion to charge that third possession as a felony, meaning sentence over more than 1 year in state prison, which would thereby, under this proposition, give the defendant the opportunity, in a sense, to get treatment for his drug addiction, have the choice of getting the treatment or going to prison. And the idea behind it is that people would be strongly incentivized to get the treatment. They would get off drugs and life would be good. It doesn't provide any funding for the treatment centers, but it has that approach. There was a lot of discussion among the proponents of Proposition 36 and the legislature and the governor about this issue, because the problem with the property thefts is real. I mean, I don't know how many of you have personally experienced it, but it's out there. And they had been talking about trying to come up with something that they could both agree to that would be either passed by the legislature or be presented to the voters, and they were not able to reach an agreement on that. The big problem was, a big area of disagreement was on the drug side. And so, so what you ended up having was you have this Proposition 36 on the ballot. What the legislature did was in August, it passed a series of 10 laws, all of which were signed by Governor Newsom, addressing the property theft issue, doing much of the same thing about increasing the penalties and stuff for property thefts, the $950, basically allowing multiple, aggregating them, dealing with somebody who has multiple convictions, to allow them being treated as felonies. And the reason the legislature, well, there's probably two reasons that the legislature did that. One is, I think they may have thought it was a good idea, but also I think part of it was as a way of opposing Proposition 36, because Proposition 36 deals with two subject areas, the property theft and the drugs. The legislation passed by the state legislature deals with the property theft. So if the idea would be is if Proposition 36 is defeated, you would still have the state legislation on the property theft, but you wouldn't have the drug change. Just making sense? Okay. Anyway, take a look, obviously, at the stuff that's in your voter guide, which will talk a little bit more about this. One of the problems with the timing is because the legislature waited until the end of August to pass this, a lot of the materials dealing with Proposition 36 don't talk about what the legislature did because the materials were prepared before the legislature acted, but it's out there. Proposition 6 would eliminate the constitutional provision in California that allows involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons. But that means under both the federal and the state constitution, slavery is prohibited. But there's an exception both at the federal level and the state level, which is that, and I'm using the term slavery and involuntary servitude to mean the same thing because the terms are used as the same. In both the federal and the state constitution, there's an exception that involuntary servitude is permitted if a person is imprisoned for a crime for which that person has been convicted. So that a prisoner, so that the constitutional provision does not prohibit requiring a felon in prison from working against his or her will without getting paid. And this has led to some unfortunate results. I think we've all seen the movies about the chain gangs in the South and whatever else, in which you essentially have prisoners being used for free labor for private enterprise, for private businesses, and treated badly and all the rest. Those may be some most egregious examples, but there are views that even in the enlightened state of California, this has been led to some areas that are improper. So what this particular amendment would do is it would eliminate that exception. So it would not permit involuntary servitude even for prisoners in state prison. It basically eliminating the stick. It does provide that if the prisoners in prison can be incentivized to do work, such as having their sentences reduced, getting credit against their sentences for the work that they have done. So it isn't that they wouldn't do any work, but they'd have to either get paid money or do it voluntarily or getting something that they want, that they're agreeable to do. It kind of leads the language in the amendment is somewhat vague as to exactly what the limits are, in the sense of, clearly forcing somebody to work on a chain gang would be not allowed. But what about if somebody is in the dining room and is supposed to bust their plates? I mean, I can tell you what I think the answer should be, but it's worded fairly broadly, and so it's really unclear what amount of compulsion could be required under this provision. Anyway, take a look in there. It passed the legislature, I think, virtually unanimously, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just, that's kind of the idea is. And the concept behind it is that people in prison are entitled to certain rights too. And you'll have your own view as to what you think about it. The last one I'm going to talk about, yes?
So right now, most prisoners do receive wages that are put away for them, or they get canteen credit or something like that. Does this have, does it have to be market rate? Is that what the change is?
Well, no. What it is it talks about involuntary servitude, meaning they can't be forced to work if they don't want to. Doesn't mean how much they get paid. So if they're willing to work for $2 an hour, then they'll work for $2 an hour. If they're not willing to work for $2 an hour, they can't be forced to work at all. That's the idea behind it. Now, it may have the effect of causing an increase in the amount that prisoners get paid, because if they can't be forced to do it, that may have that effect, but it doesn't mandate that happening. Okay, the last one on the ballot is that I'm going to talk about, which is all of them, is Proposition 35, which provides permanent funding for Medi-Cal healthcare services. As you're probably aware, Medi-Cal is for lower income individuals, and the costs of that are split between the federal government and the state government. And so California passes through its budget process, provides money for that every year, or sometimes it's a multi-year allocation, and also for certain other healthcare related services in addition to Medi-Cal. The specifics of what the state is providing vary over time depending on what the legislature decides to do. There's a pot of money Medi-Cal, the Medi-Cal share is fairly fixed in certain ways, but other portions are available. And there's basically, there are certain health plans, such as the Kaiser Permanente is in. The taxes on them raise about $7 or $8 billion a year, so there's a good chunk of money available. What this particular measure would do was it basically would provide what that money had to be used for, kind of put a fair amount of specificity as to which medical or healthcare expenses have to be paid out of this, and remove some of the discretion from the legislature as to what to allocate the money to, or whether to allocate it to something other than healthcare. The argument in favor of that is the same argument you get, say, because there's several laws dealing with education, is that you're providing some assurance that politics isn't going to get in the way of this good cause. The opposite potential view is circumstances change. And what is a proper expenditure in 2024 might not be the best use of the money, even in the healthcare field, in 2028. And so what you're doing, if you put it into law through this, is you're basically depriving the legislature of its discretion and ability to be flexible based on changing times. Anyway, yes?
I think you hit on a really important point that crosses most of these propositions, which is when we pass a proposition, we remove the ability of the legislature to do and have any kind of flexibility. So Prop 33 is necessary because Costa-Hawkins was passed as an initiative. The legislature cannot change it without us coming in and voting again. And Prop 36, same thing. So part of the decision-making for me always in these initiatives is, this sounds like a great idea. Do I want the legislator to never, ever be able to change it ever again? Right? And maybe I do. But that's a piece of it, is we're taking the power, what you just said, we're taking the power away from our elected officials to modify the budget in this particular case. Mm-hmm. In the future, no matter what happens, they can't do it.
Right. And part of the reason for the initiative, I mean, you're exactly right. Part of the reason for the initiatives process in California was way back when, in the 1900s, the railroads ran the government in California. And they ran the legislature. And so the initiative process was designed, if the legislature is not going to listen to the people, we're going to do it ourselves. And so the fact that the legislature can't change it is actually, it's a feature, not a bug. But anyway, it does have two sides. Anyway, any other questions before we wrap up? Thank you. I appreciate you coming.
On the part of the Social Justice Committee and the Congregation of Temple Israel, we want to thank the League of Women Voters, and you were so informational.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Oh, and Happy New Year, well, of course. Okay, I'll give it back to you.